Hola amigos, and welcome back to the next video in my 19th century army series. In this video, we're going to cover the Mexican army from 1866 to the early 1890s. This is the Mexican army when they're still fighting the French, but really that last big year when they're fighting the French. And I'd like to discuss first really the composition of the Mexican army, the men and the officers. And the men were drawn largely from the lower classes, from the campesinos, from the peons, a lot of mestizos, a lot of Indians, while the officers, on the other end of the spectrum were drawn from really the wealthy classes, the landed gentry, educated men from prominent families. And the army at this period, it started out really coming out of their war with France as a pretty large army. In 1867, they had roughly 60,000 men. And when Porfirio Diaz came in, he didn't really trust the army, and he comes in to lead the country in 1876, and he doesn't trust the army at all. Having been part of a coup himself in 1871, he takes steps to reduce the size of the army, and part of it is under the excuse of reducing the expenditures. But the army will fluctuate in this period, from 1876 into the 1890s, from as low as a little over 22,000 to about as high as a little over 37,000 men. A far cry from the 60,000 plus it had been in the 1860s. These soldiers were spread out. Taking 1884 as an example, in 1884 the army consisted of 34,050 men, and they were spread across 27 battalions of infantry, 1 battalion of sappers, 13 regiments of cavalry, 4 battalions of artillery, a number of fixed companies, and a corps of invalids. And, the infantry, the sappers, the artillery, and the cavalry are pretty self-explanatory. The corps of invalids were soldiers who could not perform field duty anymore, but they could perform light garrison duties. And the fixed companies, as best as I can tell, were companies of men that were tasked with defending military installations, so fortresses, arsenals, and other military parks or neighborhoods. Discussing first the infantry, we're going to talk about the uniforms. And the uniforms for the infantry were fairly basic. Sandals, white trousers, and a white tunic. The soldiers could wear a shako or a kepi, or sometimes even a straw hat. The shakos and kepis were often covered with a white cover. That cover sometimes also extended over the visor. Occasionally you would see a white neck curtain, and on the shakos in particular, you would sometimes see men with a pom-pom on over the cover. You'd occasionally see the shakos uncovered and the kepis uncovered too, but covered does seem to be the norm. Concerning the arms, from 1866, really with the end of the American Civil War, the United States government was in a position and more than happy to provide a lot of arms to the Mexicans. And among those arms would have been Springfield rifle muskets, Enfield rifle muskets, and even some older, Model 1842 Springfield muskets, which would have been a smoothbore 69 caliber. Those weapons were provided, because the government just had a bunch laying around. Additionally, in late 1866, the Mexicans would start receiving Winchester 1866 carbines and rifles, though they did not get any muskets like you see, being pretty widespread in other places. In addition to those weapons, you're going to see a lot of French stuff, and you're also going to see older British, Brown Bess type muskets. They're going to be around. They're going to get very quickly phased out. But the rifle muskets, the Springfield and Enfield rifle muskets, will stay in service into the early 1870s. Also, there would have been large numbers of 1865 and 1863 Spencer carbines in service. Now, the first real purchase the Mexican Army made for themselves of a modern rifle would have been the Peabody rifles, the Model 1869 Peabodys, chambered in .43 Spanish or 11 millimeter. They were followed up in late 1871-72 by the purchase of Model 1871 Remington rolling block rifles, likewise in .43 Spanish. After the adoption of the .45 caliber trapdoor Springfield in the United States, the Mexican government would purchase large numbers of the older Model 1870 Springfield rifles in .50 government. In the 1880s, a number of Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifles and carbines, they'll be added to the mix. chambered in 44 Winchester centerfire. Hotchkiss bolt-action rifles will also be adopted on a small scale, about a few hundred, chambered in 43 Spanish. It's a 5-shot bolt-action rifle. And they will also pick up surplus U.S. Navy Remington rolling blocks, chambered in 50 government. By the 1890s, they do pick up a number of surplus U.S. trapdoor Springfields in 45 government, model 1873s, 79s, and 84s. Up next is going to be the Mexican cavalry, and at least to me, from the Remington paintings and from other depictions I've seen, they do seem to be a bit more of a premier arm of service, as you see them typically in their full uniforms and not their white fatigue uniforms. Their weapons after, from 1866 into the early 1870s would have been, Spencer carbines, model 1863s and 1865s. Beginning in the 1870s, they're going to start getting the Remington rolling blocks and the Whitney carbines, and they're going to be in 43 Spanish, but some of those guns will also be in 50 government and 5650, the same cartridge as Spencer fires. Like the infantry, they will receive some numbers of Winchester 1866 carbines. In the 1880s, they'll also start to receive Winchester 1873 carbines and 44 Winchester, and a very small number, I believe 200 Hotchkiss bolt-action rifles and 43 Spanish. In addition to those weapons, they're also going to receive in the 1890s Nagant Piper carbines, and that's an 8-shot revolving carbine, and they don't seem to have procured a lot of them, but they are very well known. Finally, the Mexican artillery. I just wasn't able to find a lot on the Mexican artillery. I know that they had some old French muzzle loaders, like some 24-pounders. They were probably fortress guns. They did use some mitrailleuses against the Yaqui in one of the Yaqui rebellions. And so there's an opportunity if you're using a Mexican army in the game of the Men Who Would Be Kings. You can use a machine gun in the 1880s and 1890s. But other than that, I just wasn't able to find it a lot. Next, we're going to move on to the rurales. They were the Mexican rural police, and they were kind of like a gendarmerie. They patrolled a lot of the roads, the railroads, the villages. They guarded money shipments and things like that. And Porfirio Diaz really trusted these guys. While he actively reduced the size of the army, he really put a lot of his efforts into the rural police, and they were well armed. You see them with sabers, with Winchester lever-action rifles, model 1866s and 1867s. They have Whitney carbines sometimes, and they assist the army. They do keep order themselves in the rural areas. They fight the bandits and things like that and Indians, but they also assist the army. If I were going to use them in the game of the Men Who Would Be Kings, I would probably use them as mounted rifles, perhaps. They were mounted, they were well armed, they were otherwise well equipped, they were motivated men, and they really were a premier force in Mexico at the time. Finally, we come to the very humble rural militias, and they were as they sound. These guys were not uniformed, they were not really trained, they were armed very poorly. They probably weren't super motivated, but they were there, and they would augment the army, or they'd augment the Guardia Rural as was necessary. And so they'd be something else to add to your army. I would also rate them as irregulars, probably poor shots, armed with obsolete weapons, and unwilling. They're there, they are a troop type, but they're probably not your best troops. I forgot to actually give a rating for the Mexican infantry. I would rate them as regulars. I'd rate them as unwilling and poor shots. They were not particularly enthused to be there. They were drafted, they were from the countryside, and they weren't really that well trained. But they were, for the most part, very well armed, unless you're going to do late 1860s, early 1870s, and some of the troops that still had the muzzle loaders, and then I would give them poorly armed. But generally, they're still going to be well armed. For the cavalry, I might rate the cavalry, and I don't have any evidence for this, but I would just probably rate them as regular cavalry, or perhaps poor shots. I don't think they were as well trained. But I just get the feeling they were not as unmotivated. I could be wrong. They just seem, at least in the Remington paintings, they're a jaunty lot. For the artillery, I have really no idea. I don't see them being mentioned much. I'd probably have them as like a well-drilled machine gun if I were doing like a mitrailleuse or something like that. For the rurales and militia, I already gave my ratings, and comes down to the end is, why would you want to do a Mexican army from 1866 to the 1890s? Well, because it's an interesting army. In the late 1860s, 1866, 67, you can fight the French, and after that, you can have the option of fighting bandits, peon uprisings, Indians. You really have a lot of interesting stuff you can do with the Mexicans, and they're overlooked, and they really would suit the game. The Men Who Would Be Kings are perfect for it, because with the peons and the Indians and the bandits and the Mexican army and the militia and stuff, you can incorporate every troop type into a game. And there's not really a lot of wars outside of like colonial Africa or Asia where you can do that, but you can do it in Mexico, really up to the 1890s, and that's actually kind of cool, I think. Now, this was one of my shorter videos. I kind of did it by the seat of my pants, but I'm pretty happy with this one. If anyone watches to the end, please let me know what you want to see, if you like it. And thank you for watching, and goodbye.